since 1868, when Wilkie Collins published The Moonstone, detective fiction has remained among the most popular of genres. As policing has evolved, so too has crime fiction. But few authors have sustained popularity and critical acclaim more than P.D. James. Her central character, Chief Superintendent Adam Dalgleish, has solved crimes in 14 of her novels. He represents her view on morality and humanism. At her home in London, P.D. James told me why for her, detective fiction is about much more than solving a mystery. P.D. James, welcome to Talking Books.
Nice to be here.
When you first started writing, you were quite definite that you would write detective fiction. Why was that?
Well, I was quite definite I would start with it. I don't know at that stage that I thought I would remain with it most of my working life. But then, of course, at that stage, I didn't really know whether I'd be accepted or not. But it seemed a natural choice. I didn't consider anything else. I very much enjoyed detective fiction as a girl and as a young woman. I love structure in a novel. I do love a novel to have a beginning, a middle and an end. Not surprisingly, I think Emma is my favourite novel because it's beautifully constructed. I didn't want to use personal experience very much, my husband's illness or what happened to me in the war. I wanted to get away from that, and that's always been so with me, really. I don't write autobiographical novels. And I thought it would be a wonderful apprenticeship for someone setting out with quite high ambitions. You know, I didn't expect to make a lot of money, but I wanted very much to make a reputation as a good writer. And I thought, you know, if I can do this well, it will be a most wonderful apprenticeship.
You said that you weren't sure whether your first novel would be accepted. You're not a writer who has a study papered full of rejection slips. In fact, Faber and Faber, who you sent your first novel to, Cover Her Face, accepted it straight away, didn't they?
They did. I was extraordinarily fortunate. I really was very, very lucky indeed. I'm not sure whether I would be able to persevere, as some people do, putting a novel on one side and thinking I'll try again and then trying again and then rewriting. I admire that tremendously. I suppose I probably would, actually, because I couldn't bear not to be a writer. But I'm very glad to have been spared it. I think that takes a lot of courage and perseverance.
You're clearly somebody who has a passion for literature. I wondered if there was ever a time where you thought, I'm going to move away from the genre of detective fiction and I'm going to write the kind of classical literary novel, given that you've said that Emma is your favourite novel. I just wondered whether you'd ever thought that.
Well, I moved away with two of them, really, Innocent Blood and The Children of Men.
Yes.
And I must say I found them much easier to write than the detective novel is. But I never felt that I was working in an inferior form. I never felt I must show that I can do something else. Those two novels were written because I had an idea which really didn't fit in to the detective story conventions or format. They demanded something different. But I can see the influence of the detective stories in both those novels, actually. I think I would guess that whoever had written them either read or wrote detective fiction. But I think now I should like to do something a little different, and that's what I'm considering. But I've so much enjoyed detective fiction. I love the plotting and planning. I love the setting, the bringing the setting alive. I love the research and finding out other things, and the sense at the end that it all comes to fruition, that the puzzle gets solved at the end. It's deeply satisfying, I think.
I was very intrigued to read that you said that you couldn't ever imagine writing a book that didn't involve death, that ever since you were a child that you had a fascination for death and that you were aware of the fragility of life. I found that so intriguing. Can you just explain a little bit more?
I think it's rather intriguing. I can't really explain it. It's not as if I had any awful experience when I was a child. It's not even if I were taken in to see dead granny or dead granddad, you know. But I seemed always to be aware that life was short and fragile. For example, if somebody was talking, or my parents were talking about the holiday, I always used to think, if we're still here, which does seem rather ludicrous. And I think it's always been with me, and a fascination with it. But I think as far as writing novels is concerned, death is so much part of life. It's there all the time. And to think that one would write a whole novel with no suggestion that death was there, that death was going to be the natural end, seemed to me a strange idea. So that if I wrote a novel that was not a detective story, I think somebody would bite the dust in some way or other.
Let's talk a little bit about the character who has dominated all of your fiction, Adam Dalgliesh. He appeared in your first novel, Cover Her Face, in a way that you wouldn't expect him to become the serial character of your fiction. He was obviously there, and we had some sense of the tragedy that informs his vision of the world, that his wife had and his son had died when she was in childbirth. And did you know when you started writing Adam Dalgliesh that he was going to be the protagonist of 14 of your books?
I deliberately created someone who could continue if I were lucky. And I think I learned a lesson both from Dorothy L. Sayers and from Agatha Christie, who both got a little fed up with the detective they created. Of course, Dorothy L. Sayers changed Lord Peter completely, made him much closer to the kind of man she would have liked to have married. And there were changes in Poirot, not such significant changes, but I know that Agatha Christie said that, he was round her neck for the rest of her life. So I thought he must be a believable human being, but I gave him the qualities I admired. I thought if he's going to be a hero in this novel, and if he may continue in other novels, then let's make him brave, very brave, but not foolhardy, compassionate, but not sentimental, deeply private in many ways, and highly intelligent, and give him some interests, which would be more my own interests. And then I thought, well, he should have an artistic interest of some kind to be a complete human being. And I have a feeling that the sort of man I created would more reasonably have been a musician in some form or other. But I don't know enough about music to make that credible. Whereas I think I do. I love poetry, and I think I do understand the poetic impulse. So I thought I'd make him a poet. So there he was. And certainly when I look at the first Dalgliesh, he certainly has developed quite a lot but then he's developed over a great many years.
You say you don't write autobiographical novels, but in your book, talking about detective fiction, you say that if you're going to create a serial character, you inevitably endow them, as you've just explained, with interests and concerns that the writer has.
Absolutely.
Is he at all like you?
I think he's like the type of man I would be if I were a man. I hope I would be that kind of man. Yes, I think so, and I think I understand him. So his reaction to things is very much my reaction. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's quite silly to say you don't write autobiographical novels, because all fiction is to an extent autobiographical. And much autobiography, as I've often said, is fiction. But so you can't get away from that. And I think we see it in other heroes of detection. This is the man very close to their writer. Morse in particular, I think.
I want to talk to you about what inspires you, because so much of what you've done with the genre is to do with your creation of a sense of place, as well as a very, very clearly defined development of your characters, and making not just Dalgliesh but all of your characters people who are fully rounded in a way that developed it from Dorothy L. Sayers or Agatha Christie, because to a certain extent their characters were stereotypes, and in some respects our memory of them is to do with caricature almost. What is it that interested you in moving the genre in that direction?
Well, I suppose because basically I feel I'm a novelist and I'm deeply interested in human nature. And certainly in the so-called Golden Age, what these women were doing, in fact all the writers were doing, they were creating an ingenious puzzle. It was a kind of literary game, and a great many people were engaged in it. It seemed as if anybody who could put a sentence together was trying to write a detective novel. And of course many of the academics at Oxford who did it with great success were good writers, so they were writing well. But their idea was this is a puzzle, and you just have to solve it. And I think what I'm doing is trying to write a novel about human beings under the stress of a police investigation for murder. And there can hardly be a greater stress, really, if you are a suspect. And that means, you know, that these have to be living human beings. So I think this creating characters who are rounded, who are real, and you feel you can enter into their thoughts and into their lives, is tremendously important to me.
Your decision to talk about place and describe place, you've talked about it as being, in some respects, the starting point for your stories.
It is indeed, rather it is, yes. It's tremendously important, I think. And this is where the inspiration comes. And I can visit a very lonely stretch of beach, and often a community of people, the publishing house, a nurse training school, and think, this is where I want it to happen. And that comes first. And I think I have a very strong response to place, to the spirit of place. And I love describing place. And I think it's tremendously important in any novel, but in detective stories it's particularly important. And you have to do it with reasonable economy, that's the point, because it all has to come together. That's part of the fascination, that there has to be a sort of coming together of plot, of place, of characterization, of theme, into a sort of unified whole. But place is a very important aspect.
So in terms of character and place, you've developed the genre, but you've stuck to the tradition of detective fiction, of the closed community.
Absolutely.
That you talk about.
I love the closed community. Yes.
Why?
Well, because I think when you get people together in a closed community, and often have no choice about it, they're very different people thrown together in this close proximity, living together, then all sorts of very human emotions of jealousy, of dislike, sometimes of love, of sexual desire, of ambition, of envy, can smoulder away and erupt into, if the worst comes to the worst, into violence. And they're all there underneath. It's, I think, studying men and women in a community is always fascinating. And indeed, even studying men and women in committees is fascinating.
Morality, and a very strong sense of morality, is very, very important to you in your novels, it seems to me. Do you see detective fiction as a place, as a moral space for talking about values in society?
It's a very interesting point, isn't it? Is it? It's difficult to say that it is. I think, basically, it is for entertainment and relief from the traumas of everyday life. I don't think we go to it for any kind of moral lesson. But the morality is there because what it says that murder is a unique crime, that even the most unpopular, even evil person has a right to live life to its last natural moment, and that it is the business of civilized society to bring murderers to justice. Whether it is justice and whether we do it in the right way and whether they are entirely responsible for what they do are very difficult questions. I don't think the detective story actually addresses that, but I would think that Dalgleish would address it probably.
I just wondered whether you think, as some writers of detective fiction think, that they use their books as a way of holding a mirror up to society. For example, Sarah Paretsky does in a very, yes, very overt way, in a very conscious way.
Indeed she does, and I have a huge admiration for her. Yes, this is related to what you were saying. I think I was making a difference between actually pointing a moral and reflecting the society as it is at the moment. And I think that is one of the most valuable things a detective story can do.
You're obviously still writing, but all the people who are attempting to take the genre forward in a different way, and I'm thinking of the Swedish writers,
yes,
it was Stieg Larsson and Henning Mankell, those writers who are trying to do something yet again with the genre. How interested are you in that?
Yes, I don't read as widely as I should do in the translations, but I think this is an interesting development, particularly in Sweden. But this really is related to showing society as it is. And your Wallander is not actually preaching a sermon at any of us, but we can see what his reaction is to the kind of people he mixes with. And these problems are dealt with in detective fiction, I think, very, very effectively, in a way other fiction seldom seems to manage to do. I mean, if we, in this country, in Scotland, if you want to know what the problems of policing in Scotland, you get more from Ian Rankin than you will from an official report. And this is certainly true of Wallander, for example. I know more about Sweden and the problems of Sweden and how this country, which has seemed to be so very liberal, and so very open and so very civilized, has much the same problems as we have here.
When you talked about the Swedish writers and and the characters that many people are now familiar with because they've been adapted into films and television programs, Lisbeth Salander and Wallander, they are still outsiders, but they're doing all kinds of different things with their detection work. And in that context, I wondered if it ever occurred to you that because they're taking the genre in a particular direction, whether in that context Adam Dalgliesh may seem somewhat old-fashioned now.
Well, I wonder if he is. He is very much a professional policeman, and he operates within the rules which are there, within the judge's rules. He doesn't go outside them, and he doesn't tolerate people going outside them. So to that extent, he may be slightly old-fashioned. But I think this is the safeguard that we all have, to feel that those rules are there. And there are things the police can do and things the police can't do. And I feel if I wanted a detective who could move outside the field of what is permissible and what is morally right, then I'd be better to have an amateur who has this freedom. I don't think Dalgliesh has freedom really to go beyond what a professional policeman should do, both in the way he questions people and the way in which he tolerates any deviance on the part of his subordinates. But I think beyond that, I think he's a very modern man. And I think he's very aware of the ambiguity of his job. He's very much aware, and I think this is increasingly so, of the harm his investigation can do to the innocent as well as to the guilty, of the extraordinary pain of being submitted to the kind of interrogation. I mean, it's a horrifying thought, isn't it, that if you're a parent and your child is murdered, you are number one suspect. And of course, unfortunately, with very good reason, because most children are killed by parents or step-parents. So the police are perfectly reasonable in looking at that. But if you know this is a dearly loved child and you're facing the worst tragedy you could ever imagine, what an appalling situation to be in. And I think Dalgliesh is well aware of this, and I think the reader knows that he's aware of it. I think that his compassion does come through very clearly.
We were talking about Ian Rankin just a moment ago. He had the courage, temerity, madness maybe, to retire Rebus. Have you ever thought, Adam Dalgliesh, about time you retired? You've been going at it for nearly 50 years.
Well, of course, he's very fortunate. He never gets any older. He's sort of stuck in young middle age forever, unlike me. Well, the last book was, in a sense, The Private Patient is quite valedictory in a way. So if he's going to retire, maybe I left him that he would probably give up this special job and probably have some business sort of being part of a committee that's going to look at the whole of police training throughout England and Wales. And it's about time we did. And whether the police are organised as they should be. I mean, it's going to be a time of great change for the police. And he could be involved in that. I think the really brave thing is to kill him off. And people have done that, of course, when Morse has been killed off. But I was thinking, somebody asked me if I was going to kill him off, and I was amazed how disagreeable the thought was. And I realised how much he'd become part of me, that would be a kind of vicarious suicide. So I think we shall die at the same moment.
I want to move away from the writing of detective fiction to its portrayal on television and cinema. What interests me is that there appears to be just as intense an appetite for the rural murder mystery of the Midsummer Murders type, as well as the kind of fast-paced, fastly edited, CSI, forensic, the emphasis with forensics on those sorts of stories. And yet they are so different.
Aren't they? It's extraordinary. There is. Somehow I think the English village is rather like the closed society. The English village is a closed society. And still you can have this sense of people moving, having a hierarchy, moving like pieces on a chessboard, according to whether they are the squire or the doctor or the chemist or the school teacher or the pigman or whatever he is. And I think also people feel a sort of sense of going back to a past that was more organised, that was safer. And then you have this contrast with murder, and that is rather exciting, I think, for them. And it becomes more effective because there is a contrast. If you had murder in a sex club in the East End, or in some city area where there are lots of sex clubs, there isn't the excitement of contrast. But the body on the vicarage floor is different.
It seems to me, though, that the interest in both of those sorts of crime dramas, if you like, whether they're set in an urban environment or in a rural one, innately the interest is to do with resolution. It's almost that there's a reassurance in wanting to solve a puzzle, that something terrible's gone wrong, and that there is a resolution at the end of it in quite a short space of time.
You're absolutely right. And that's really almost the raison d'etre of detective fiction. And that's why detective fiction is, and this is undoubtedly true, most popular in times of social unrest, of times of anxiety, at times of war, times that we're going through at the moment where there is a resurgence and some very good writing and some very original writing and some new people coming along. And that is because you can be in a society in which it's possible to feel that some of our problems, shall we say youth crime in our inner cities, are so difficult that no matter how much money we've thrown at it, how many social workers we recruit, the problem is insoluble. And here we have a very comforting form of popular fiction, and there is a problem at the heart, and a very appalling problem. And by the end of the book, indeed, it is solved. And it's solved not by good luck or divine intervention. It's solved by a human being, by human intelligence, human courage, human perseverance. And that's incredibly satisfying. And you do get what the reader feels is justice. Of course, with the modern detective story, you realize that it isn't really justice, but you do get a solution. And you do get justice of a kind. And I think that is why the detective story is so attractive and so reassuring.
And when you look back on your life, do you feel I have really very few regrets, particularly in terms of your writing life?
I have very few regrets, really. And those that I feel I have, I'm not sure I would have been a better writer. My formal education ended when I was 16. And I would love to have gone to university. So I sometimes feel if I joined one of the women's services, then I would have been able to get on and go to university, and that would have been wonderful for me, and I would have read far more and been much better educated. But against that, would I have been a better writer? I'm not sure that I would have been. And anyway, I mean, I didn't do it, so that was it. And so it's not a keen regret. It's not a keen regret, and I think I've been extremely fortunate.
P.D. James, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much.